Okay, welcome to the SumerSports show. We're actually going to do a Saturday edition because, look, Friday got away from us work-wise. There was just too much to do during the afternoon. I was at the office doing the taping of the SumerSports Sirius show, which you can watch, listen to on SiriusXM, Channel 88. So, and then last night the show was on, so we couldn't record during the show. We couldn't compete with ourselves. So we're going to do Saturday morning. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at SumerSports. I'm joined by our exquisite data scientist, Ben Brown. Ben, I feel like this is a scene from the Big Short. Like, you've already worked out. You've already had 2 poached eggs. You've already been to your son's hockey game. You come back. You're already ready to go here. You're wearing the Sumer hat, the umlaut. It's perfect stuff. Ben, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah. Like you said, we maybe haven't figured out the correct timing of this podcast, but I think we're working through it. And yeah, I have already 8 eggs today. I'm not a big poached eggs guy, I would say, either, but I have 8 eggs. I have gotten up, done a little activities, so I'm good. I know you slept until 10 o'clock, living the actual dream, I would say. But it's been good. I don't know. It's been a chaotic week, obviously, with NFL free agency and everything else kind of popping off. We are, just a few short weeks away from, the NFL draft, which, the epitome of the off season. Our Minnesota Vikings made, I would say, an initial move as well. So I think there's a lot to get after, I would say, from an NFL news perspective, for sure.
Yeah, I was on. I did some tapings for the Hammer Betting Network, which are one of our good friends, Rob Pizzola, owns that company, and they were asking me what my favorite free agency teams were, and I had to put the Minnesota Vikings. I know mistakes have been made in the past, and I think I think a lot of the fan base, of course, is split, and I've had certainly my run-ins with that fan base, but they're given everything, right? Given the fact that ownership in Minnesota wants to win every single year, right? They haven't had basically a meaningless game. They had a meaningless game in January this year, but they haven't had a meaningless game really in that December forever. Probably 2014, 2011. So they're always competitive. I think that's what the Wilfs value in Minnesota. And so it's always going to be tough for Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah to come in with a quarterback. So he comes in, Brad Holmes comes in a year earlier, Brian Poles comes in the same year as Kwesi. So you're all looking at that same division. Right. And I think from a bird's eye view, the Vikings have been passed up, right? The Packers have a franchise quarterback. They were in the divisional round of the playoffs. They gave the Niners a run for their money, a better run for their money than the Vikings under Cousins ever did, including in the 2019 divisional round. The Detroit Lions had a 17-point lead in that stadium in the NFC Championship game, just 2 years removed from being 3-13-1 in the first year under Brad Holmes. And then, of course, the Chicago Bears, who haven't won much of anything under Ryan Poles, but are starting to accumulate a roster, right? They just acquired Keenan Allen in a trade. They go out and get DeAndre Swift. They got a Montez Sweat and DJ Moore the year before. They're starting to build around what presumably is Caleb Williams at 1, and we're going to talk about the betting markets at the end of the show vis-a-vis the draft. But it looks like the Vikings have been passed up, and I think and my negativity would say it's because they tried to win games the last 2 years. My empathy is, well, Kwesi didn't really have a Matthew Stafford to trade, right? Matthew Stafford's a much better quarterback than Kirk Cousins, so he was able to get a bunch of assets for him and rebuild the team. Brad Holmes was. Kirk Cousins is sort of more valuable to Minnesota than any other team, so they stick with him. Kwesi's predecessor, Rick Spielman, left. Christian Darrisaw left. Brian O'Neill left. Justin Jefferson. It was always going to be hard for them to completely flame out. So now, of course, you have the trade with the Houston Texans just a couple days ago, where Minnesota moves up to 23. They give up 2 second-round picks, including this year's second, next year's second, to go up and do so. They very much are positioning themselves for a trade. It is going to cost a lot to get that finally get that franchise quarterback, young guy into the stable. But I'm excited for that team that they're finally turning the page and trying to actually realistically compete in the not only in the NFC North, but also in the NFC and possibly for a Super Bowl at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely agree with what you say. I would say like the ultimate goal does seem to be with not necessarily completely resetting the franchise, because that's really difficult to do because of the core key players that they have. But I think in a lot of ways, the free agent acquisitions that they got this year in a lot of ways frame up, hitting at the quarterback position when they do go up and get the rookie quarterback. And then they're really set up for success because it is a really good situation to fall into. The only, I think they'll probably, it depends on obviously what happens when they do move up, but they might have like tipped their hand a little bit too much in the sense that they're going to probably have to pay up more than other teams now to get the second overall pick or to get the third overall pick. And I think that's maybe the one cautionary thing that I don't feel great about. But I think from like who they signed in free agency and what they're trying to do right now, it makes so much sense from a team building standpoint. And that's why I hope that it does work out. But I do obviously have the question of like, how much is this going to cost to actually get their guy? When and if they do, like, how far up do you think they need to go? Because to me, I don't think, going to 6 and getting the JJ McCarthy is really what they're intending to do at this point in time.
Yeah, they can't. So I took out the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, which we know is wrong. But the fact of the matter is, like, in the NFL, there's kind of two different trade charts. There's the trade chart that has been around forever, which if people don't know, it's the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, which was built in the late 80s by a guy named Mike McCoy, who was working for the Dallas Cowboys. And at the time, of course, in 1989, Ben, there was no free agency. The draft picks were paid basically market rates when they came in. And so it was based upon the market rate of every pick. And so it's incredibly steep, meaning the first pick is worth a ton. The second pick is worth a little bit less, or like quite a bit less, and it tapers off substantially. Almost every single analytical model, remember, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has cut his teeth sort of in the same way that we have, where we're an analytical, professions before football, and then we get into football. Almost every analytical model you can, like, if you guys want to Google one of our good friends, Ben Baldwin, the Ben Baldwin draft chart, he did a good job of going through and actually explaining how to build one, sort of the Brad Spielberger, who's our former colleague at PFF. That way, those are incredibly shallow. And I think that those shallow curves, especially the ones that are based upon surplus value, they almost always underestimate what the resulting first overall pick ends up being worth. And then subsequently the second, third, and by the time you get to like the mid first round, it's pretty well calibrated, all those trade charts. But early on, like right now, for the Vikings to get up to 3, they basically have to give up the 2 ones that they have on the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, and then another pick kind of in the 80s or so. To get up to 4, it's kind of basically right there. But there's always a premium that's going to be paid for these top picks, especially for quarterback. Because you and I did all this work on the mock draft simulator, PFF. A quarterback in the top end of the draft is worth 4 times as much as a non-quarterback. So it just screws up all the trade charts. I think the Vikings did this move to see how the market evolves, because I think that there have been mistakes in the past, right, Ben? The Jets traded up to 3 in 2018, and I think they did so for Baker Mayfield. I thought at the time Sam Darnold was supposed to be the first overall pick, Saquon Barkley was supposed to be second, and Mayfield was, I thought, that their preferred choice there. Of course, Mayfield goes first. Now they get Darnold. It doesn't work. Right. I think that the 49ers traded up to 3 without an understanding of who their quarterback was going to be. Yeah. And then it went, and I truly believe, like, I remember it, and Peter King just retired. He's a legend. I remember texting Peter King, who is as dialed in as anybody in football, a legend of the game. I remember texting him the night before the 2021 draft, because as you and I know, we had thousands of dollars riding on this draft pick. And I texted him and I go, who are the Niners taking? He texted me back, goes, Mac Jones.
And
that's Peter King, right? So, like, no one knew. And the Niners included what they traded up for. So I think Kwesi being like a very evidence-based, allows things to work out. Like and we're going to talk about the betting market later. Like, I don't know. I don't think they know whether or not they're moving up to 3 or 4. And I think that they're going to let the market dictate how that is, with the backstop of 23 is a pretty nice place to go ahead and take Michael Penix as your second first rounder, to take Bo Nix, whichever one they like. Very similar to when the Vikings in 2014 took Teddy Bridgewater late in the first after they took Anthony Barr as kind of their pillar player there. So that's kind of how I see it, Ben.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really think about the late end of the first round potentially being a valuable spot, because they probably would have their pick of like the second tier, not necessarily the second tier, but like that the fifth and sixth quarterback situation window. I think probably develops, I would say, in the 20s. So I actually at first kind of thought like that was in some ways not going to be a valuable pick if they moved in that direction. But I do think if they can kind of have their second choice of those guys. So do you not think that they have one particular player identified right now? You just think there's quarterbacks across this draft class that they could potentially be interested in. They're just keeping their options wide open. Because I think
it's very unlikely that out of the top. So let's take Caleb Williams out of it. Caleb Williams is the first pick, until further notice. I would be very surprised that if they, out of the 3, so Jaden Daniels, Drake May, and JJ McCarthy, I would be very surprised if they only liked one of those 2 quarterbacks. And I think that that's the cool thing if you're a Vikings fan, which is that they have optionality. Like New England, so let's talk about New England for a second, because New England has, I think that there's a very real tell that happened in free agency this week that got some attention, but I don't think people understand what the underlying realization is. And that's when Josh Uche got like a 1-year, $3 million deal up to some other amount, right?
Yeah.
Josh Uche's been one of the most productive, kind of Kyle Van Noy-ish, kind of, outside backer, old school 3-4 out, player. And I think many people thought he wouldn't necessarily have the market that Bryce Huff had.
Right.
But they also didn't think he would sign for less than $10 million, for God's sakes. And I think it uncovers something very fundamental about the New England Patriots, which is, sure, the New England Patriots struggled last year. Yes, 100%. They were bad. Offensively, a travesty, all this kind of stuff. And Bill Belichick did not get a head coaching job. And I think that has, a lot of people are taking that differently than maybe, I think they're over-indexing on that part. Bill Belichick and his staff did a masterful job of coaching defense last year. If you look at their defensive statistics, if you look at their, any way you look at it, DVOA, you look at yards per play, all this kind of stuff. The New England's defense was phenomenal last year. And without a superstar, right? Like, name one blue chip player, maybe Christian Barmore, maybe, but Kyle Duggar is kind of in that category, but they're not a great defense from a top tier talent. You take Belichick, you take Belichick's son, you take some of those pieces out of that coaching staff, and I think New England's much worse fundamentally than even they showed last year roster-wise. If Gerard Mayo and company know this, there's no way they should take a quarterback at 3, because that guy's going to come into one of the worst environments of a modern day quarterback has gone into.
Right.
Now, I think that's the leak. If you are Kwesi and company, you want to get Drake May, as I do think if cooler heads prevail, that 3rd pick will be available.
Yeah. I mean, at that, I do. Yeah, I very much didn't pick up on the Uche signing like you did, and I think in some ways it is a tell. And I do think there are, going back to it, just a lot of tells that you can pick up just based on the approach for what teams were going to do coming from free agency, right? Like, I think that's an obvious thing, but I think picking up on those lesser known or lesser index situations can very much influence decisions. So I don't know. I do like that actually quite a bit. And I do think 3, you are still allowing Washington kind of make that decision on Daniels or May, and taking like the lesser of or the opposite decision. And obviously Caleb Williams is, very much assumed to go number 1. But I think if they can land at 3 and have the Drake May. Like this is very much in a lot of ways the perfect free agent offseason to build to that point. So I think it's exciting for sure. So
yeah. So here's the other one, because obviously the second overall pick is a big deal, and the Washington Commanders were incredibly eager and active in free agency under Adam Peters and Dan Quinn. And number two, okay, they go out and get Marcus Mariota. They trade Sam Howell. So a lot of people are saying are saying this means Jaden Daniels is the quarterback. And okay, well, the Colts just signed Joe Flacco to be the backup to Anthony Richardson. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have the same type of backup as you have your starter. But the markets have adjusted, right? The betting markets have made Jaden Daniels a clear, not a clear favorite, but a pretty big favorite to be the second pick. What's your read on this? Because I still think the Washington Commanders can move up to 1, and I think that I would not rule that out at all. And B, I think that Drake May is still in play for them at 2.
Yeah. So I did say this on the Class Play podcast, which, plugs Sumer. It's on Wednesdays. Basically, Sam Brookhouse does an amazing job as the host. And we're getting a rotating cast of Sumer analysts, I would say, in that spot with him. But yeah, I did say on that, I do think the Mariota, and this was pre-Sam Howell trade, I did think the Mariota signing indicates their preference for Jaden Daniels, or if they still have considerations of going to Caleb Williams. Like, I think that makes a ton of sense as well. So, so that was my indication. I haven't really come off that. I do think it is the most straightforward, prediction to come for free agency with where things stack up in the draft. But I think they are going one of Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels. I do agree with the market moving in that direction. I think on that day, before the Marcus Mariota signing, I think it was like, I do believe Drake May was actually still the favorite at that point. And I think it was minus 125 when I looked that day. And now it's out to minus 155 according to FanDuel. So 135, is that what it is?
No, Drake May is the minus 135 favorite to go third on FanDuel. Jaden Daniels is minus 155 to go. And it was Drake May as much as minus 150 in this spot. So again, and look, the draft, there's not a ton of liquidity you can get here. We are seeing JJ McCarthy. He was plus 550 yesterday. He's been far longer odds. Marvin Harrison Jr., who I think the Cardinals really like, is what I'm hearing. But they probably like 2 first-round picks more than they like.
But like you said, they have the stockpile of picks already, right? So in some ways, they in a sense are the one team that could go out and actually get a blue chip guy and not mitigate the cost of like actually going down, or not necessarily find it as valuable as a lot of other teams. So that's why I think the 4 pick is kind of a weird inflection point for how the draft plays out as well.
Yeah. And these markets are really interesting. So for example, the Vikings are the second favorite to take Bo Nix. Like there's just a very interesting, I mean, even you have a silly team to take Blake Corum, who's going to be like a 3rd or 4th round pick. First offensive lineman taken, Thomas Dimitroff, and I talked on the SumerSports Sirius XM show about Oli Fashanu, who I think that there are scouts in the NFL that like Oli Fashanu better than they like Joe Alt, even though Joe Alt is prohibitive favorite here. So these are just interesting markets to look at. The first defensive player drafted is one that's also going to be very interesting because, Ben, this is, and we don't give out betting advice a ton on the show, but taking Dallas Turner here is maybe the worst bet you can ever make. Because anytime you have one of these picks that's you're laying $2 to win $1, and you're waiting until pick 8 at the very earliest, there's just so much crap that can happen. Imagine a team falls in love with Jared Verse or any one of these guys is sort of like a styles make fights thing. And yeah, Dallas Turner is awesome. He has great athleticism. I was on the Vikings YouTube Vikings.com the other day, and I was like, Dallas Turner, if the Vikings don't want to draft a quarterback there, they should take Dallas Turner. But looking this far out, like any markets like this where it's not a top 10 pick and the favorite to go first quarterback or first linebacker, first safety, first is anything more than like even money, don't bet into it. It's really bad. That's a bad market to do. Do you have any? Yeah, I think that this, I'm excited for these markets to sort of start to shape out here. This is another one that's very interesting. Brock Bowers, who was once like thought of as like kind of a San Diego Charger or Los Angeles Charger, is now considered a favorite to be a New York Jet. Without but the Jets are the favorite here. I find that to be interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, and going back to kind of your point previously, obviously the multi-way markets are difficult. It will be interesting to see if we do get, as we have in prior years, like the evolution of the two-way market on individual players and those sorts of things. And I do think those are, kind of where, a lot of the money can be made from a draft betting standpoint. So obviously we haven't gotten those markets yet. I would still anticipate we get them at some point, but those are obviously really difficult to price even this far out, a month and a half away. To me, I did think JJ McCarthy made a lot of sense for the Vikings previously to the trade. Obviously, now I think it's moved way too far in that direction. Projecting any one team is sort of difficult. I do want to look at Worthy's odds. Xavier
Worthy. So I would venture to get. Can't see. To me, this is one where Kansas City at 14-1 just feels right.
It does feel
like a flyer if you're trying to take a little money and make a lot of money. That one to me feels like an interesting. Is he going to be well? So for one, we've seen Brett Veach. We've seen Brett Veach trade up for players that he wants, right? And so the question of will Xavier Worthy make it to 32 might be academic. They might go up and get him. Buffalo just signed Curtis Samuel. So that kind of takes away a little bit of that speed gadgety guy. Although I think Worthy is actually undersold as a speed gadgety guy. He's actually been a productive college player, unlike some. The Panthers pick at 33. That's after the Chiefs. But, again, if the Chiefs pass on a wide receiver, the Panthers make a lot of sense there. Chargers, Texans, Cowboys, those kind of seem like, end of the first round. There. And Beat Gamer has a good question. Is Xavier Worthy a good fit with the Brown signing? Like the Brown signing, the problem with that is Brown, it's kind of similar players. I get that. But Brown has a 1-year, $7 million deal. Like you don't make you don't make draft picks for this year, right? The Chiefs last year at 31, actually, there was one less pick, took Felix Anazuke-Uzama. Right. And they signed Charles Memenahu to a 2-year, $11 million deal. Those are similar players. But one guy is going to be the long-term solution at the thing, and one guy's trying to win them the Super Bowl. The Hollywood Brown signing is to try to win the Chiefs the Super Bowl. Remember, Rashee Rice this year set the record for Andy Reid for the most receiving yards by a rookie. They don't play rookie wide receivers in Kansas City unless it's a break glass in case of emergency type of situation. And so that's kind of where I stand on that, but it's a very good question by Beat Gamer, who's one of our very good listeners. Yusef Cockbane, you need to have access to Betfair Exchange when you can lay it back.
Yeah, he's from Europe, though. He's from the UK. I mean, they are so much more developed than what the American market is. That's what I mean. Those are in some ways end goals for sure. But
I mean, I think we talked about this last week. Betting exchanges are awesome, and I think that we would love to have them in. And there are some, for example, New Jersey. I'm forgetting the name of the company, and I apologize. It's actually doing pretty well, but like it's just hard to get liquidity, and I don't think that the betting population in the U.S. is educated enough for exchanges yet to have the liquidity that they need to be as successful as they want to be. But that's a good point. Here's a good question by Dean here. Do you see the NFL changing the dates for free agency and the draft in the future? So what we're seeing right now, and I implore anybody who's listening to this show on a Saturday with me and Ben, two sickos, one of my best friends in the world, you gotta, if you're sick enough to watch this show on a Saturday, go to YouTube and search 1990X draft. So like the 1994 draft, the whole first day is on YouTube. You can watch that shit. And the craziest part of the 1994 draft, Ben, is the San Francisco 49ers, who were going to win the Super Bowl in 94. Like they had a dream team, Ken Norton Jr., Deion Sanders, Steve Young, Jerry Rice, all this stuff.
That wasn't Deion Sanders was a mercenary, basically.
He was a mercenary. They had to trade Bill Romanowski on the day of the draft to get under the cap. That was the first year of the salary cap. The NFL used to be much more condensed
Right.
as far as free agency in the draft. Now we've kind of, I don't see them changing the dates because this is like the perfect spread for them,
Of
right? You have Super Bowl, yada, 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 right? You have about 2 weeks for all of us to calm our nerves. Then you have the combine, which is like, and then you have 2 weeks, and then you got free agency. Then you have a little bit of time for all of us to call, and then you got the draft. And then I don't see them taking up less of the calendar, Ben, than they are now.
Yeah, I mean whoever designed the schedule of the offseason for the NFL, I think deserves a ton of credit. I don't know who that actually is, but because when you look at other leagues and things, and even the scheduling of games is a disaster, you realize how well the NFL has done to build the juggernaut that they actually have. But I'm in agreement. I think it's perfectly spaced out at this point. I do think in some ways, the gap from the draft to training camp is the widest one, but at some point we need a little bit of break. Even the sickos do, I would say. So I don't know, to go back to the original question, and I know this is kind of the opposite of what we discussed with the Minnesota Vikings, but I do think my overall NFL favorite free agency was the Houston Texans, obviously for opposite reasons. I do think, but the Vikings and the Texans kind of being linked so much, trading player or swapping players in certain scenarios, I think in a lot of ways is a cool indication of the two paths to potentially being successful in the NFL from a team building standpoint. Obviously, the Vikings need to figure out the quarterback situation and hit on their rookie guy. The Texans have already done that and are now kind of stockpiling around it. I do think that there's the concern of how well CJ Stroud plays in his second season on the first the toughest schedule basically with the first overall playing against the division leaders. But I think the Texans in particular, if you have confidence in the quarterback class and are on that rookie deal, this is the way in which you kind of maximize that Super Bowl window. And in some ways, I think they're probably not necessarily right now this going to be the second best team in the AFC, but I think they've kind of set themselves on that path post free agency with what they did.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I tweeted this out yesterday. I think that Houston is the team that Kansas City has to worry about. It's funny because we've said this about the Chargers, we've said this about the Bills, we've said this about the Bengals, and of course Patrick, other than the 1 year against the Bengals, just continues to slay the dragon. But Houston, Donnell Hunter's a great signing. I think Joe Mixon. Nothing took the air out of the stadium in Cincinnati like Joe Mixon running the ball, but he still is a pretty good, he's better than Devin Singletary, I'll say that. And so he had something there. The offensive line there has always been good. And last year, wide receivers emerged on that team. That was always the question I had. I'm I think this is a pretty decent team if they get some wide receivers in the stable. They get Azeez Al-Shire, who I think is quite a good linebacker and has always done really well with San Francisco. I can't believe Tennessee only signed him to a 1 year deal with Boyd's and let him go in case. And that was another signing that I really liked with Kenneth Murray. Right. They let Tennessee sign Kenneth Murray and let Azeez Al-Shire go. Didn't make a ton of sense to me. But yeah, that's a really good take, Ben. I think that right now you really have to consider if you are betting for the Super Bowl. Obviously, you want to lay off Kansas City, lay off San Francisco, Baltimore. You're paying a premium for all those teams.
Right.
If you're going to bet now, which is to tie up your money for 11 months, you have to get something 20% return. When back in the day before we joined Sumer, back when we could bet at PFF, I remember we went out to Vegas. I put a decent amount on Rashawn Gary at 50-1 to win Defensive Player of the Year. It had to be a reason to come back. And just because, you don't want to be betting 5 or 6-1 because that's just simply not enough. Ben, when you look at the NFC and you look at kind of the basically the landscape of the NFC right now, if you have, and let me find the actual NFC odds here. You have San Francisco. Let me just share the screen here.
Yeah, put it up.
You have San Francisco as the favorite at about 5-2. You have Detroit at 6-1. God, we are the world here. Dallas at 13-2. Philadelphia 15-2. Green Bay at 10-1. Atlanta, Kirk Cousins at 13-1. The upstart Los Angeles Rams now no longer with Aaron Donald at 14-1. ZT's Chicago Bears.
Who's going to
in
stop
the chat
them?
here in the chat? Bear down, Chicago Bears 22-1. Tampa Bay 25-1. Minnesota at 30-1. Seattle right around 30-1. Saints 38-1. Giants 42-1. Cardinals at 42-1. Commanders at 55-1, and the Panthers at 100-1 to win the NFC. This is obviously the weaker conference.
Right.
A lot can happen here. Do you think the Niners are too heavily favored here, given all the brittleness that is building a roster around a non-quarterback, basically?
Right.
And if so, which one of these prices do you like the most?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I do think you hit on kind of obviously in a somewhat joking manner, a really good point in the sense that if you do track these future markets, even in the season, in a lot of scenarios, you are going to get a buy opportunity on a team like the 49ers or a team like the Chiefs in the regular season. I would say more often than not, to the point where laying that as like a favorite in the preseason just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So I do think and I do think in this particular case, the 49ers are overpriced very much for the narrative that you suggested, in the sense that they have built a really legitimate roster, agnostic of the quarterback in a lot of scenarios. But I think that if you lose Trent Williams for an extended period of time, and in some ways they're going to continue to have to figure this out, because, I think defensively they weren't as good as they've been in prior years. I think that's going to get even worse this year if they lose one or two guys because of injury, and key offensive skill positions. Like, to me, they're not even close to the 49ers. And I think in a lot of ways, the Cowboys might have a somewhat similar makeup. And I think that from that perspective, like, Detroit, obviously really highly valued, but they're the team that I do more often than not see winning the NFC. I do think right now, based on what I would potentially want to get into, I would look at further on down teams because of the weakness that I would find at the top, and like the Cowboys and the 49ers, and to a lesser extent the Philadelphia Eagles. Like, I do think there are some longer case narratives that could definitely be driven. We did talk with the Vikings. If you do hit on the quarterback, like, that's kind of in some ways like a Houston Texans situation from last year. And if they get hot at the right time, that does make sense. I don't want to sound like a homer. I do think there is maybe a similar narrative you could build around a Bears team. I'm not saying it's going to happen, anywhere close to a decent amount, but I do think based on the price that you're getting offered right now, that range of like even the Rams to Seahawks, I do think there is value that you could find on any one of those five teams.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't have to be bashful about this. Vikings at 30-1 is a great bet. Or what are we talking about? Like, you have let's back this thing up. Brian Flores was phenomenal last year.
Right.
That defense was horrendous talent-wise. And they got a lot out of it. They get Van Ginkel, they get Grenard. Now they lose Danielle Hunter, but Hunter, was 30. They get Blake Cashman, who's a pretty good linebacker to go along with Ivan Pace, who had a great rookie year as an undrafted player. The secondary is not great, but I think Flores did a really good job of covering that up. They get Harrison Smith back. I think that the safety position, they're really good with Metellus, Bynum, and Smith. Corners, Kwesi is an analytics guy, throwing a lot of numbers at the position. Right. So I think defensively they'll be passable in this conference. And then offensively, yeah, if Darnold or JJ come in and look, Kevin O'Connell made Kirk Cousins a lot better than
he was very good. When he got hurt last year, that was by far the best football Kirk Cousins has played as a Minnesota Viking, I would say. So
yeah, and he turned out to be likable, and like the big thing with Zimmer was that he hated Kirk Cousins, and it like sort of permeated throughout the whole roster. It was hard for Kirk to lead. Right. I think that the Vikings have the goods here. The other teams that I like in this one are the Cardinals at 42-1. They have 13 draft picks. They have a premium pick. They could get like a vet. Like, what's keeping them from getting T. Higgins in a trade, right? I proposed this a little bit ago where, let's say the Bengals wanted Marvin Harrison, and they trade like 18 and T. Higgins for pick 4. They had to you'd have to round the numbers off a little bit with other picks, but you could go. The Cardinals have a franchise quarterback who's good. No one really wants to admit. They're rebuilding their offensive line. They got Jonas Williams, they got Paris Johnson, 2 first-round picks at tackle. They have some playmakers there. Defensively, yeah, they have a lot of work to do, but they have a lot of picks, and you don't have to be great defensively to win games in this conference, Ben.
Right. And Gannon, and that's where obviously you would expect him to win in certain scenarios, turning over that side of the ball relatively quickly. I don't mind it, to be honest. And in some ways it plays into the idea that, the NFC West, I thought was going to be kind of the juggernaut conference last season in a lot of ways and didn't live up to it. If you do think the 49ers are susceptible, like it kind of does open the floodgates for any one of those teams to get through. So I don't mind that. Yeah. I mean, I think there is narratives around it. I do think, the 49ers are obviously overpriced. I do think the Cowboys are overpriced. Kind of think the Eagles as well. Obviously, you need to have some sort of expectation of who's going to win it at the top. But this conference overall just does seem way more wide open than it's ever been before. And I think it's going to make for an exciting race overall.
ZT asked why are the Falcons 13-1. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a hint. Kirk Cousins' numbers always look good internally. PFF, like we worked at PFF, we're not going to disparage them, but like when Kirk Cousins found out what grades well at PFF, he hit that hard, right? There's a reason why Kirk Cousins has a top 6 PFF grade in his career, but has made the playoffs only 33% of his time, has never really – the Vikings offense in the Kirk Cousins era was 14th in EPA.
Right.
He's not an effective quarterback, but he knows how to smash the passer rating buttons and the PFF quarterback. Right. So anybody that's modeling, including us, because we use EPA, we use various CPOE. Kirk Cousins often very good at that number. Like anybody that's building a internal model to handicap the NFL is always going to like Kirk Cousins more than they should. And that is why the Falcons are 13-1. That is why the Falcons are 13-1, because Kirk is a good quarterback whose numbers look better than he really is, in my opinion. So, and granted, they should be favored in the NFC South because that division is struggling a little bit. I actually disagree with you on the Dallas Cowboys. With everybody, and I know that the Skip Bayless is like, oh, all in, comma, my ass, that tweet. and the teams that sit out free agency often win free agency, folks. And so I would like Dallas. I'm a Mike McCarthy fan more than average, and I think that team will win 12 games. And I do not believe that there are teams that can't. I don't believe that Dak Prescott can't win in the postseason. That's like kind of my point, and I get that. But yeah, it's funny there. Yeah, this is a very interesting market. Let's look at the AFC just briefly before we end today. Going in here, the Chiefs, the Ravens, the Bills, the Bengals, the Texans at 11-1. We already talked about. To me, feels like that's the play. Although now they have shorter odds than the Dolphins, who.
Right. It is. In some ways, the narrative has pushed dramatically to the point where by the end of the offseason, I could see them being one of the most overvalued teams. In some ways, getting out ahead of that does make sense. I don't know. It is also crazy to me to see how far everyone has moved on Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars, as far as like where they're being priced and stuff as well. So
I could not agree with you more. There was a person on Twitter yesterday that tried to argue with me that like there have not been any impact high-end quarterbacks in the draft since Joe Burrow. And obviously that's false. CJ Stroud like took a Houston team, and I'm we're obviously friendly with Jack Easterby. He was on the front office there. He's a great guy. But like that Houston team had to tear this thing down and do not like basically bleed for 3 years. CJ Stroud waltzes in and they're winning playoff games and playing in the second round of the playoffs. I don't think you get any more high impact than that. And then, of course, the Jags picked first overall 2 years in a row, and then they won 9 games 2 years in a row. I'm sorry. What else do you expect out of these quarterbacks? Trevor Lawrence has been, and I know like Press Taylor hasn't done a great job, and like there have been a number of things, but the idea that Trevor Lawrence hasn't accomplished anything in the league is ridiculous too. 20-1 on the Jags makes a lot of sense. They went in and got some players like Ronald Darby in the secondary. Right. Josh Allen's on the franchise tag. He's still pretty good. I don't like the Gabe Davis signing. I don't like switching out Gabe Davis for Calvin Ridley. But like, you have the quarterback, and he was injured for a lot of last year. They were 8-3 before he was hurt. And so, yeah, that one's weird to me. Ben, let me throw one at you before we go. Tennessee at 60-1.
I knew it was coming.
Has a shot, right? Like, because Will Levis is the kind of quarterback that people like you and me miss on, right? He's got a great arm. He's kind of stupid. Let's be honest. Like, but it's those dumb quarterbacks. It's the Josh Allen types.
They think they can make everything go. Yeah.
But they when the buttons click for those guys, they end up being pretty good. You have Ridley, you have DeAndre Hopkins, you have Tony Pollard to pair with Tajay Spears. Not having Derrick Henry in the backfield obviously is not good, but it also will keep them from running 40 times a game, which is positive. Their offensive line's a joke, but they will have, opportunities to go pick guys high in this draft, and the offensive line market in this draft is very high. What say you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite tweet all week was when Calvin Ridley responded to somebody saying he was overpaid, say that it was like the perfect amount of payment for $92 million. I mean, I don't think that, obviously we saw Ridley's best performance last season, but I think in the right scenario, like, things could pop off. I like the Chidobe Awuzie signing, like, Tony Pollard in the backfield, swapping him out for Derrick Henry, I think in a lot of ways could open up some things for them offensively. And like you said, like, I'm very much not sure where I stand on Will Levis still at this point because of those reasons that you just talked about. And there is an upside case to this team being good and kind of figuring things out. And I don't think, in a lot of scenarios it works out, but at 60-1, I definitely think there's at least a case to be made for.
Yeah, I think every other long shot here is awful. The Raiders at 41. Who is your quarterback? The Denver Broncos at 71. I was defending Sean Payton I think Sean Payton's a good coach. Cotton, if you go 17-17 with Ian Book, Trevor Siemian, Jameis, Russ, who stinks, and Jarrett Stidham, you're a good coach. I just don't think that they have the goods to win this year. They don't have any money, right? It's going to be a while. So it's going to be a long-term build, and he's got the contract to be able to bleed it out. New England, as I said before, you cannot make a number big enough for me to want New England to win the AFC or to win the NFL just because they just don't have the talent. Right. So if you're going to go for a long shot here, Tennessee feels like it. Everybody else, it's like you got to go through Kansas City or you got to go through – if you go through the AFC North, every one of these teams that goes through the AFC North is beat to shit by the time they get to the playoffs. So it's that one's a bad beat. That one's a bad bet as well. So I like Tennessee as the longest of long shots, even though I am a Houston Texans, CJ Stroud, Bobo. It will be that to me feels like a solid play. Ben, as the weekend commences here, we have the beginning of March Madness next week. We have the draft coming up. I know. We got into the markets a little bit today. We're not going to talk about other sports. I'm excited for when SumerSports. When we drift into other sports, we get to talk about soccer and we get to talk about basketball and all this kind of stuff. But what is Ben Brown doing this weekend? What is the recommendation for the loyal listeners today? Of which there were many. We appreciate everybody that has come into the chat on a Saturday afternoon. It felt like morning because I got up late today. But what's the recommendation for this weekend for the fellas?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked too much at anything. I do miss, the WNBA sweats coming soon enough. I think if you were going to go anywhere, it has to be one of your alma maters, Nebraska. There it is, right there. I mean, it's
America's team,
basically. So I think
America's team playing Illinois today. They're 2.5-point dogs. Right around 3:00. My daughter does have a volleyball game, so I'm going to be that parent that's like watching the game while also trying to watch the game. There's no points in parenting, so you just do what you have to do. Very, very fun. We're going to let you guys go. This has been a lot of fun. Check out the SumerSports 2024 NFL Draft Show on SiriusXM. Channel 88. I have to look this up really quick because there are some replays this weekend. Let me find those. They are this weekend at 4 a.m. and 9 a.m. Sunday. So tomorrow, if you have a SiriusXM
I'm doing
account,
that instead of church, is what it sounds like. Basically.
Yeah, like look, me and Thomas are taking you to church anyway.
Right.
It's going to be a religious experience to listen to us. We have Jeff Schwartz on the show. He's a phenomenal. He was a blocker for Adrian Peterson's 2,000-yard season, and it's a lot of fun. Also, if you're looking, this is the off season. It's a perfect time. Go out and get Football Analytics with Python and R, a very fun book to learn about how to code and how to analyze football so that you can be like Ben. So, for Ben Brown, for Eric Eager, this has been the SumerSports Show.